Someone walked out of your life without a single word. No argument, no exclamation, no goodbye, just silence. And everyone around them had the same reaction. How could they do that? How could someone just disappear like that and feel nothing? They called it cold. They called it selfish. Some called it cruel. But here's the question nobody thought to ask. What if coldness had absolutely nothing to do with it? What if the person who cut everyone off, the one who seemed completely unbothered, completely unreachable, was actually the most emotionally sensitive person in the room? And what if that sensitivity was exactly why they disappeared? Because the people who go silent aren't usually the ones who feel the least. Research in emotional psychology suggests the opposite is almost always true. They're the ones who feel everything, too much, too fast, and with nowhere left to put it. That changes things, doesn't it? Think about the last time you walked into a room and immediately felt something was off. Not because anyone said anything, not because anything visible had changed, just a tension in the air, a shift in someone's energy, a look that lasted half a second too long. Most people don't notice that. But some people can't not notice it. They walk into a room and absorb it like a sponge. Every undercurrent, every unspoken frustration, every micro-expression that crossed someone's face for just a fraction of a second, it all lands, all of it, immediately. And then it stays. You replay the conversation at 2 a.m., not because something obviously went wrong, but because something felt slightly off and your mind refuses to let it go. You felt your friend's disappointment before they even spoke. You sensed the shift in someone's mood before they were aware of it themselves. Psychologists call this heightened emotional sensitivity. But in real life, it doesn't feel like a psychological trait. It feels like exhaustion. It feels like being permanently switched on in a world where everyone else seems to have a volume dial, and yours was removed at birth. It shows up as hypervigilance in relationships, constantly reading the room, constantly adjusting, constantly managing invisible emotional temperatures that nobody else seems to register. And here's what makes this quietly devastating. Most of it happens in complete silence. Nobody sees it. Nobody names it. It's just this invisible, private kind of pain that hums underneath everything. So here's what doesn't make sense on the surface. If these people feel this deeply, if connection matters this much to them, why do they eventually go completely numb? Why do they cut everyone off and walk away as if none of it ever happened? Here's where it gets fascinating. Because this isn't really a story about personality. It isn't about someone being difficult or damaged or emotionally unavailable. It's a story about the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do. When you experience emotional pain inside a relationship, repeatedly, consistently, without resolution, your nervous system starts taking notes. It begins building a case, and eventually it reaches a verdict. This person is a threat. Not consciously. You don't sit down and decide that. Your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, the part that has been protecting humans from danger for thousands of years, makes that call before your conscious mind has even finished processing what happened. The withdrawal isn't a decision, it's a reflex. Neuroscientists call this emotional dysregulation, when the nervous system becomes so overwhelmed by relational stress that it can no longer maintain a stable internal state. The brain stops trying to manage the connection, it starts trying to escape it. Psychologists use a concept called the window of tolerance to describe this. Imagine your capacity for emotional connection as a cup. When experiences stay within that cup, manageable, processable, safe, connection feels possible, even beautiful. But some people's cups are smaller, not because they're weaker, because of experiences that shaped the size of that cup long before they were old enough to understand what was happening. And once that cup overflows, the only instinct left is to stop pouring. So the person doesn't pull away because they stopped caring. They pull away because their nervous system issued an emergency response, and compliance wasn't optional. Curiously, this raises a deeper question. Why is the cup smaller for some people than others? Where does that capacity come from? And what happened long before this relationship, long before this moment, that made connection feel so much like danger? The cup wasn't always that small. Something made it that way. Imagine a child who reaches out for comfort, for reassurance, for the simple human need to feel that someone is there. And instead of warmth, they find criticism. Instead of safety, they find dismissal. Instead of presence, they find a parent who is physically in the room, but emotionally completely unreachable. This happens quietly, without drama, without a single moment you could point to and say, that's where it broke. It just accumulates. And over time, the child's brain draws a conclusion that feels completely logical given the evidence. Needing people leads to pain. Vulnerability is dangerous. Reaching out is a risk that rarely pays off. Psychologists call this insecure attachment, a pattern that forms in early childhood when the people responsible for making us feel safe consistently fail to do so. Not always through cruelty, sometimes through their own unprocessed wounds, sometimes through cultures and families that treat emotional expression as weakness, where crying is embarrassing, where needing comfort is indulgent, where the unspoken rule is, handle it yourself. And the child does. They handle it themselves. They build walls not because they want distance, but because distance became the only thing that felt predictable. And here's what makes this so quietly heartbreaking. The adult who cuts everyone off isn't someone who stopped caring. Research in attachment psychology consistently shows the opposite. These individuals often crave closeness more intensely than most people. But wanting connection and reaching for it feels exactly like standing at the edge of something dangerous. So they stay close to the wall, even when it costs them everything. And here's how it plays out in real life. You've probably seen this or lived it without ever having a name for it. It starts beautifully. The connection feels electric. They're all in, present, warm, almost overwhelmingly attentive. This person makes you feel like the most important thing in their world. And for a while, it's genuine because they mean it, every bit of it. But then something shifts. It's rarely a dramatic fight. It's usually something small. A comment that landed wrong, a canceled plan, a moments where they needed reassurance and didn't get it. Something that from the outside looks completely manageable, but inside their nervous system, it's not small at all. The anxiety starts building quietly. They pull back slightly. You might not even notice it first. And then one day, without warning, without explanation, they're gone. Completely unreachable, like a door that was wide open suddenly has no handle on the outside. Psychologists call this emotional flooding followed by defensive detachment. The nervous system gets overwhelmed, flooded with more emotional input than it can process, and the only exit it knows is total withdrawal. The friend who went all in and then vanished wasn't playing games. The partner who seemed perfect and then disappeared wasn't performing. They reached their limit, and their brain did what it always does when the cup overflows. It stopped accepting anything new. What's important to understand is this. These aren't failures of character. They're survival strategies, patterns built for a previous version of life that are still running in the background, even when the danger is long gone. But here's what nobody talks about. If these people know this pattern is costing them the connections they desperately want, why can't they simply choose differently? This is where the science becomes genuinely surprising. And this is where everything you thought you understood about this behavior gets quietly dismantled. Researchers studying rejection sensitivity disorder found something remarkable. For certain individuals, social rejection doesn't register as emotional discomfort, it registers as physical pain. The same neural pathways that process a burn or a broken bone light up when these individuals experience relational rejection. It's not metaphorical, it's neurological. Now imagine carrying that inside every relationship, every moment of distance, every unanswered message, every interaction that feels slightly cooler than yesterday. All of it hitting the nervous system like a physical wound. And then consider what researchers found when studying disorganized attachment, a pattern where a person simultaneously craves closeness and fears it with equal intensity. These individuals don't experience relationships on a spectrum between comfortable and uncomfortable. They experience them as a constant contradiction. Come closer.
Trauma psychologists have identified something called the fawn to freeze response. It describes a pattern that will feel immediately recognizable. The person over-accommodates, they give, they adjust, they absorb, they make themselves smaller to keep the peace. They do this for weeks, months, sometimes years, until one day the system hits a wall, and the warmth doesn't just cool, it vanishes entirely. Here is the insight the title promised you. These people don't cut others off because they don't care. They do it because they care so profoundly, so completely, that staying becomes unbearable. The withdrawal isn't indifference, it's self-rescue. And that realization leads directly to the question that matters most. What does this actually cost them? Here's what nobody sees. After the door closes, after the silence settles and the withdrawal is complete, there is no relief. Not really. There is something quieter and far more painful than the relationship they just left. There is grief, private, unacknowledged, and completely invisible to everyone around them. They grieve the friendship they ended. They replay the moments that were genuinely good. They wonder at 2 a.m. whether they made a mistake, whether the threat their nervous system detected was even real, whether they destroyed something valuable to protect themselves from a danger that may never have arrived. But going back feels impossible, because returning means reopening something they've already stitched closed. It means being vulnerable again in the exact place where vulnerability once felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. And their nervous system, that ancient, exhausted alarm system, won't allow it. Not easily, not without a fight. So they stay alone, and they tell themselves it's fine. Philosophers have long explored the tension between self-protection and self-destruction, and this is where that tension becomes most visible. The wall works. It keeps the pain out, but a wall doesn't discriminate. It keeps the warmth out, too. Every act of protection is simultaneously an act of isolation. Every act of protection is simultaneously an act of isolation. Psychologists describe what follows as chronic loneliness, not the sharp, dramatic kind that arrives after a breakup or a loss, something quieter, a background hum, a persistent sense of distance from everyone and everything. It doesn't announce itself, it just sits there, underneath the surface of daily life, constant and unacknowledged. And the most devastating part? Most of them never tell anyone, because telling someone would mean letting someone in. And letting someone in is exactly what they've spent years learning not to do. If you recognize this in yourself or in someone you've lost, that recognition matters. Because understanding what something costs is always the first step toward asking whether it's still worth paying. So where does that leave us? With something more useful than judgment, more useful than sympathy even. With understanding. The person who cuts everyone off isn't cold. They aren't cruel. They aren't broken beyond recognition. They are someone whose nervous system learned a lesson, early, repeatedly, and without their consent, that connection was dangerous. And they have been living inside that lesson ever since, paying a price they never agreed to, protecting themselves from wounds that may have healed long ago. The behavior makes complete sense, given the history, given the neuroscience, given everything the brain was trying to do. And here is what matters most. A pattern that was learned can be unlearned. Not quickly, not without discomfort, but the wall was built, which means it isn't permanent. It was constructed in response to a specific kind of pain, and with the right conditions, the right awareness, the right support, it can come down. Not all at once, one brick at a time. You're not strange for recognizing this in yourself. Your brain was doing what brains do, protecting you with the only tools it had available. But you are not the version of yourself that needed those walls. Not entirely, not anymore. The real question, the one this video has been quietly building toward, isn't why people cut everyone off. It's what happens when someone finally decides not to. When someone who has spent years perfecting the exit chooses for the first time to stay. That story is one we haven't told yet, and it might be the most important one of all.